Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session on crime and punishment. My name's Giles. I'm the economics editor of the Financial Times. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. We're going to be talking about crime and punishment for an hour and a half, not necessarily what you think of as something that economics gets involved in, but it absolutely does. At the end of this session, there's going to be a book signing in the room behind where Vicky Pryce will sign one or two. There's a few of her books she's brought along if you want to buy them. Now, crime and punishment is often thought of something as a subject that's really the matter of social affairs or justice, but economics provides really a pretty important lens on the topic. Why, when do crimes occur? Who commits them and why do they do that? How effective is punishment of crime? And how to prioritize public spending in a time of very tight budgets. And now, some of the incentives of crime have been known and been used by policymakers for many, many years. It's not something that goes back to the 60s when really the economics of crime as a discipline grew up. If you go back 700 years to the 14th century in Catalonia, in Barcelona, they worked out that if bankers went bust and couldn't pay back depositors, they should have rations of bread and water until they could repay. They found that wasn't a stiff enough sentence, and bankers still were going bust, and so then in 1321, there was a law passed that bankers would be beheaded outside their bank if their banks went down. Now, maybe you think this is what we should be doing. We'll ask the panel later. Let me introduce the panel. I'll go on my far left, or your far right, Professor Steve Machin of University College London, who is the research director of the Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE as well. He's written a lot about both the why people commit crime and also the effectiveness of the criminal justice system. To my immediate right, we have Francis Crook, who's the chief executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform, which is a charity that's tried to improve the conditions in prisons since 1866. And Francis has been running the organization since 1986, so if anyone has a wealth of information and expertise on prisons, she's got it. To my immediate left, we have Dr. Brian Bell, who's Associate Professor of Economics at Oxford University, and in lots of ways is a partner in crime with Steve Machin. They've done a lot of work together. He's a former banker as well, you want to know. And if you're a police officer in the audience, he is one of the people who recommends on your pay, so if you want to take that up with him later. He's asked me not to say that, but I thought that I should, just for full information. He's written about deterrence, particularly in the London, as it affected the London riots, and also crime and immigration, so very important topics in the public debate. And on my far left is Vicky Pryce, who is now an independent economist and author, and also the chief economic advisor of the Centre for Economics and Business Research in London, formerly the head of the Government Economic Service, and has a unique theoretical and personal experience of the criminal justice system, as I'm sure you all know, following her prison sentence for perverting the course of justice a couple of years ago. And she's also written a book, Prisonomics, about that experience, and is now the patron for Working Chance, a charity to try and get former offenders back into gainful employment. What I'm going to do, we're going to just split this session into two parts. First part talking about why people commit crime, about the incentives for criminality, and then we'll do the second part on the criminal justice system. And I'm going to open it to the floor in both halves because I think it naturally splits that way. So, Steve, you're going to kick us off.
So what I wanted to do was talk about the way in which economists think about crime and the determinants of crime. So the background to this is really that understanding crime patterns and trends, and in particular trying to study ways by which crime might be reduced, has been a key research question for social scientists for a long time. This obviously includes economists, and economists tend to try and use their analytical toolkit, which is well kind of structured within economics, to try and think about how one can set about studying crime, and importantly, from a policy perspective, what the determinants of crime are. So the economics of crime approach points to several factors that matter. First of all, and what I will spend quite a bit of my time talking about, the idea of economic incentives matter for crime. So I'll talk about the way in which economists try and think about that and try and bring evidence to bear on that kind of question about the way in which economic incentives, or particularly if economic incentives change, whether that can alter people's behavior and perhaps put somebody who was on the margins of crime, tilt them over the edge so that they do commit crime, or on the other hand, go the other way around and deter somebody from doing crime. Second, and obviously related to this, the economic research has focused, often using fairly large-scale data sources on individuals, has focused on what characteristics criminals might have, and particularly what are the characteristics of those individuals who, as I said a moment ago, are on the margins of crime. So a lot of effort has been placed on trying to think about that, and on studying the origins of why people might be at that point to maybe onset into a career of crime. The third way, and this is just the economic approach thinks about economics of crime, is what the second part of a panel will think about, which is the way that law enforcement agencies and the criminal justice system can be organized to try and deter crime, so to try and offer deterrence mechanisms that can stop crime from happening. So that might be through the spending money on crime-fighting policies, maybe trying to introduce kind of new technological change, new technologies that the police forces can use. Or it might be about specific targeted policies, for example, targeting prolific offenders, for example, would be one thing where you might think, rather than a general crime-fighting policy, you might actually think about targeting particular offenders who are well known as having committed lots of crimes. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the first two of those in my talk, and I'm going to focus on the questions to do with economic incentives and the related question about the kinds of characteristics that criminals might have. Okay, so research in this area has been pretty prominent by economists recently. One reason for the kind of upsurge, I think, in the amount of research that economists have done is the availability of large-scale data sources where one can apply statistical methods to try and empirically model crime and the determinants of crime. One central aim in this work has been to try and establish what people refer to in the research areas as a kind of causal impact of the determinants of crime on crime. So rather than just describing correlations between the characteristics of criminals and crime incidents, to try and actually say what it is that actually causes crime to occur. And so that question about causality and correlation is something that runs through a lot of the work that I will talk about. Okay, so to begin with, in terms of the way that the economic approach goes, the starting point in the economic analysis of crime is the idea that people may undertake a kind of expected cost-benefit calculation to think about the way in which they may decide whether or not to participate in legal or illegal activities. Okay. Now, I would emphasize that I would think of this as a starting point, since some people like to caricature economists as only talking about this kind of thing. The economic approach is much broader than just this kind of, the idea about rational choices that people might make. But the starting point is this kind of expected cost-benefit calculation that people might think about. So how might we think about this? So the kind of key idea is that people who are on the margins of crime, individuals on the margins of crime, they can weigh up the expected benefits on the one hand, the expected costs on the other hand, and then make a decision about whether or not to participate in crime or not. It's a bit like when you're crossing the road. You make an expected cost-benefit calculation about whether you're going to cross the road, you weigh up the expected costs and the expected benefits, the idea of the probability that you might get hit by a car, and so on, and then you decide whether you're going to cross the road or not. The point about this would be that you weigh up the expected costs and benefits of doing crime relative to a legal alternative that might be there. Now, the legal alternative is usually work. It's usually the idea that there's a wage on offer in a job, and you might think about how much you can get on that wage on offer in a job, maybe minimum wages, maybe a different job or whatever, and then you'll factor in that in terms of your calculation, and then think about what the expected benefits that you might be able to get. Now, the reason why I keep on saying expected is because uncertainty enters into this, because if you do engage in crime, there's a probability you get caught. There's a non-zero probability that you're going to get caught. And so you kind of weigh up the expected benefits that you get, you kind of try and think about what the returns to crime would be, factor in the probability of being caught, and then weigh that up against some legal alternative. Okay. Of course, if you get caught, there's a sanction associated with that, and that's what we're going to talk about. You might think of it as a monetary sanction. You might think of it as a sanction that operates in other ways, perhaps being sent to jail or prison, and so on. And that's, of course, what people are going to talk about in the second part of the talk. Okay, so the idea here is simple. The idea is an individual will do crime if this probability-weighted return to crime outweighs the legal alternative, which we can probably think of as the wage. Okay, so we get kind of clear predictions from this kind of model, in this kind of way of thinking about things. And broadly speaking, there's going to be these two sets of determinants of crime. One is going to be economic incentives, and the economic incentives, there's two components to that, one of which is the legal wage, so how good opportunities are in the labour market. The other one is the illegal wage, or the illegal return, what the criminal prospects are, what the criminal opportunities are. And we can think about both of those as thinking about economic incentives as affecting both of those. Then the other side of things is the deterrence side, which is going to be the second part of the talk. Okay. Okay, so what do we know about economic incentives? As I said, there's a lot of research that's been done on the idea that economic incentives may matter for crime. And I think we can split this into the two sides that I just spoke about a moment ago. What the economic returns to crime might be, and what the legal alternatives are. Okay, so let's begin with the legal alternatives. So there's quite a lot of statistical work that's been done looking at questions about whether if you're operating in a low-wage labour market, if those low wages deteriorate, does that shift people on the margins to participate in crime? And the answer seems to be yes, from the evidence out there. There's quite a lot of evidence from the US and the UK suggesting that if low wages get worse across areas over time, then perhaps more people may participate in crime. So evidence and economic incentives. The perhaps more surprising relationship, which is much more fragile in the existing research literature, is connections between crime and unemployment. It's actually a very fragile relationship. It seems that low wages actually, as in line with the economic model, actually matter more perhaps than unemployment in terms of what the evidence says. Then you might think, still staying with the legal side of things, there's other characteristics that people have looked at that are correlated with crime, and people have tried to establish whether there may be a causal connection between those. So education is one. So we know there's a large literature out there in economics, but if you get more education, you get a wage return from that in the labour market. You get paid more if you acquire more education. So it might be interesting, is there a link between crime and education? And not a correlational link, a causal link. So there's some work, again, from Britain and America, which has considered how you might unravel that direction of causation so that you can ensure it runs from education to crime rather than the other way around, the idea that low education people may just do... So crime is potentially determined by low education. And so the way in which some of the research has progressed in this area is that when the compulsory school leaving age has been raised, like it was in England and Wales in 1973, when it went up from 15 to 16, so that people had to stay in the classroom for an extra year, the argument is, that clearly increased people's educational levels. What happened on the crime side of things? Well, it appears for that cohort who were staying in the classroom for an extra year, actually the crime rates were lower. So you can think that that's actually causing a causal impact of education on crime. There's evidence from across US states where these kind of compulsory school leaving laws actually happened at different times. And so you get a raising of a compulsory school leaving age. People have looked at what happened to crime in those states before and after the raising of a compulsory school leaving age as well, finding that crime fell in the places where the school leaving age was raised. There's also other evidence on other demographics. We know from a lot of work in criminology that age and gender matter quite a lot for crime. We know that crime age profiles, if you think about a crime age profile, it peaks at a fairly early age and then comes down. So there's talk about onset of crime, undertaking in crime mattering. There's talk about specialization when people are there, and desistance. What are the drivers of onset, specialization, and desistance? And so there's research that's looked at that for different sorts of crime types and so on. There's work on crime and immigration, which I've done some work with Brian Bell, and there's various other papers out there which find no causal impact at all of immigration on crime. And it actually turns out to be the other way around, actually. If you look at victimization surveys, actually immigrants are less likely to be in places where more crime victimization goes on. So actually that's a kind of interesting one from a policy perspective. So I guess on these demographic characteristics of people, some of these are influenceable by policy. Education levels are influenced by policy. Immigration policies can matter as well. And so you may think about having policies that can also have consequences for crime, not just about crime in and of itself. Okay, so that's for legal alternatives. So the economic incentives seem to matter if you think about these kind of measures of the labour market, these demographic characteristics that individuals have. And what about the other side? What about economic returns to crime? Well, I guess there's 2 or 3 things we might want to think about here. We might want to think about what scope is there out there for criminal earnings. And we might think if those criminal earnings go up, criminal opportunities go up, that people may participate more in crime. So there's certain things that we might think about here. So the value of what loot is available, if you like, might matter. So if there's more valuable things in certain places, perhaps that's going to be something that might tilt people on the margins of crime. So I guess I can give you some kind of little anecdotes here about this, which matter for how crime has evolved over time. So, you know, if you go back 20 years, many kind of anecdotes were about people going and doing burglaries and stealing video players and then going and selling them on down the pub or whatever. If you look what's happened to the price of audio-visual equipment over time, it's come down massively. There's hardly any burglaries that take... there's hardly any evidence these days that video recorders are being stolen. It's other stuff that people are much more interested in. It's the kind of iPhones that people have and the iPads in people's bags in this room, which are much more likely. And so, of course, that's caused a shift away from burglaries towards street crimes, where the returns to actually think about getting stuff, and you can get much more out of a bag snatch these days as compared to a burgling a house in some ways. I mean, there's other factors where prices clearly matter, and so I'm talking about economic incentives generated by markets here. Prices clearly matter. The price of gold has gone up massively over the last 10 years. Jewelry thefts have gone up massively in relative terms as a share of crime. Actually, crime is falling, but as a share of crime, jewelry thefts have gone up as well. So you might be interested, so the value of loot is presumably something out there that shapes criminal opportunities, and that's a way in which economic incentives matter, again, on the criminal side of the market. There's also the question of security responses in this area as well. And you may think about security responses that actually can potentially lower the economic return to crime. So one very, very well-documented observation on this is that now, because of EU legislation, all cars these days have to have an engine immobilizer put in them. This has acted as a massive deterrent for car thefts, and car thefts have come down massively because if there's an engine immobilizer in the car. So this is so we can think about technology perhaps driving these kind of incentives that can affect the economic returns to crime as well. So the kind of last observation I wanted to make was on technology. And so, of course, a very up-to-date feature we seem to have in terms of the way crime has shifted, crime specialization has shifted, is into online crime and cybercrime. And the idea that technology online is actually an important factor as well. And again, you can think about rational criminals perhaps switching into these kind of areas because the economic returns, the probability of being detected is much lower at the moment, the way the technology is operated in terms of online crimes. And it certainly seems as evidence that the economic idea about people switching into where the returns are higher is certainly manifested itself in terms of internet crimes. So I guess that's all I wanted to say about the kind of way that economists think about crime. I think we have evidence out there that economic incentives do matter. They do matter on both sides of the market. They matter on how well the labour market is performing, for example, or how badly the labour market is performing, I suppose we might want to think about in terms of the current economic downturn with real wages falling by so much. Wage opportunities are clearly falling a lot at the moment with little sign of recovery. And on the other side of the market, the choice or the choice that people might make in terms of what they perceive the expected returns to crime to be. So there's clearly evidence, I think, that the economic model is useful in thinking about the way in which crime is determined, and indeed the way in which crime and the composition of crime has changed over time.
Thank you very much, Steve. That's a very, very full description of the economics of crime and where, where it works really not in a sort of caricature of the economics of crime, but where we actually see evidence of it in practice. Vicky, do you want to add something to that?
Thank you very much. Well, when I wrote my book, Prisonomics, I used actually quite a lot of Stephen's data and research, which was just coming out as I was completing the book, and that's absolutely brilliant because it linked certainly employment, even though you're now worried a little bit about low wages, but certainly employment after you come out of jail as being a serious deterrent in terms of discouraging people from committing new crimes. So it actually reduces reoffending quite significantly. And also, of course, education that you've already mentioned. But it's interesting when you think about how humans make any conscious decisions. And obviously, in my time in prison, I met quite a lot of people and did ask them why they did various things. And there are tons of accidental offenders. It's incredibly easy to move from being a non-offender to an offender. There were a number of people I met who were there through joint enterprise, which is basically they were part of a group, something happened, someone was killed or hit, and they were also done with it. It's the thing that was meant to be for gangs, but seems to have been extended so much, leaving people completely and utterly shocked about what happened to them. But really the most interesting thing for me is this economic rationale. And there is a very strong economic rationale. Of course, most people do things instinctively, of course. They see something and they grab hold of it. But at the back of the mind is this conviction that they're not going to get caught. And of course, they are right. And that's the interesting thing. Only 3 out of 100 offences, in fact, make it in front of a court and perhaps receive some sort of treatment, if you like. People commit offences all the time. They take things from work, and that's hardly reported. And in fact, it is absolutely true, and I think what Steve said is right, that the prison sentence itself is not a deterrent, because they're not going to suddenly not grab hold of something because you extend prison sentences from 3 months to 6 months for this particular thing that they may do. At all. So they're going to be doing it in the absolute belief that nothing's going to happen to them. And of course, when they do get caught, in the very major crimes they tend to, of course, but when they do get caught, they could be sentenced, whereas the next door person who also had some drugs in their pockets was simply not stopped and searched at all, and they got away with it. But the interesting thing for me, additionally, is that all these things, of course, matter, that all these people who are in prison for the reasons that I just explained, very often for quite trivial things, particularly women. But what we know is that crime has fallen more generally. Crime has been reduced, if you look at the crime surveys, not so much what is reported, because that's also gone down very significantly, but we know there is huge amount of underreporting. Police stations put rape down as non-crime, as we've been hearing the last couple of weeks. I have that in the book. I had already been aware of it. So, and there is huge underreporting by corporations as well, as I suggested. But nevertheless, crime reported, and the one which is considerably higher, which is done on surveys of whether people have experienced crime or seen crime and what exactly it was, has also been going down very significantly. It's gone down by 70% in the last 20 years. And yet, over that period, we have been putting twice as many people in jail than we had in prisons in 1996, which is an extraordinary thing. And the causality doesn't work at all like that. In other words, it's not because we're putting people in jail that crime has been coming down. It's been coming down for the reasons that Stephen has elaborated, which include, of course, technology, which is a very significant aspect of it. It also includes, actually, technology of a different type, which is in the cash points that you see in supermarkets, or if you go to H&M or wherever, where in the past, of course, hundreds of millions of pounds would disappear every week, in fact every day probably, in the retail sector, because cashiers would just pocket a tenner. Now, of course, with the barcodes and everything else, one knows exactly what's gone in, exactly which piece of of merchandise has gone through the system. And therefore, that's been eliminated to a very, very considerable extent. Yes, you have cybercrime, where, of course, it proves again that people don't expect to get caught. And they don't get caught. And look at the online fraud that's taking place. But overall, crime has been coming down for those reasons. In addition, I think, again, thinking about Stephen's points, we are getting richer, and therefore crime has been falling because of that. We are getting older, and the top age for crime is 24, and clearly I was a bit of an exception to this, but 24 is, so those of you who haven't quite done that yet, you've got a couple more years to go. Those are all the reasons for why this is happening. So for me, the starting point for my work was looking at, how do you justify what's going on right now in our prisons? But then I think looking at what type of people there are that commit crimes is, I think, crucial. Yes, perhaps we can't prove causality completely, but in fact it matters hugely, in my view. It's interesting to see that 31% of the women who are in prison were taken into care when they were children, and 24% of the men were taken into care. That there is huge amount of reported abuse of the people who are in prison. So 53% of women have been abused as children, sexually, physically, and emotionally, and 27% of men. And almost 50% of women have been subject to domestic violence, the ones who end up in prison. And that is an extraordinary number when you come to think of it. And what is also seriously worrying, again touching on what Stephen was said, is the ability of these people who then commit crimes to have a steady job. 47% of people who go to prison have no qualifications whatsoever, and over 60% are educationally substandard. I met so many women who couldn't read at all. I'm not just talking about couldn't read well, couldn't read at all. So basically let down completely by the education system already. And of course they were unemployed. 81% of women who were convicted had spent the 4 weeks before certainly being unemployed, and 67% of men. And they had been unemployed for quite a significant period of time. What is interesting for me is what happens afterwards. How do we get these people to be members of society again, to cost us a lot less economically? And the difficulty that people have when they come out, because of lack of education, because of prejudice, to get jobs again, is an extraordinary loss to society. Only 8% of women who come out of jail find jobs within the first year, and 27% of men find jobs. So there is an underclass of people that we are putting in jail, and I think a lot more work needs to be done to prove causality, not just the correlation, but to prove the causality for all the statistics that I've just given you.
Thank you, Vicky. Now, I'm going to open it up to the audience now. We could talk about trends in crime, what the incentives are, because people often feel uncomfortable talking about the economics of crime, and I wanted to open it to the audience. I just have one question for you, though, Steve, which was, we've had the biggest fall in real wages since the 1920s over the last 6 years here in Britain, and you said there was a very strong link between low wages or wage falls and crime, and yet when we've had this big fall recently, we've had crime falling. So doesn't that sort of go against what you've been saying?
Not entirely. I mean, crime's been trending down since well before the downturn, but it hasn't been falling as fast during the downturn as it was in the previous years. So the long run trend is down, but crime is not dropping as much.
So there's other things going on pulling crime down.
This is recorded crime, of course, as well. And there's other issues, I think, to do with the points we've made about technology, about perhaps the recording of crime is not quite as good as it used to be in some dimensions as well.
Right, let's open this up to the audience. If you just put up your hand and I can ask you, and if you want to introduce yourself, please do. There's a gentleman there in the second row.
Hi, my name's Chris. Would you mind commenting on white-collar crime, which you kind of passed over a bit?
I did mention that there's a lot of corporate crime, white-collar crime, which corporations just don't report. So there is huge underreporting taking place, but people know it's happened, so it comes into the overall survey statistics. But the scale of it could in fact be very, very significant, and that has not been calculated properly. Corporations deal with it, get rid of people, or turn a blind eye, or whatever, or perhaps they promote people, you know, how it happens. But of course it is interesting because the economic justification for not wanting to commit a crime, if you have a good job, is that you have an awful lot to lose. On the other hand, the opportunities to do perhaps some crime of that sort increase quite significantly when you have access to all these things that allow you to do that. So it is really the balance, I would suggest, between the loss and the opportunity that you have there. And if you then think you're not going to get caught, then you might still be inclined to do so.
Different sorts of crime, clearly you want to think about in different sorts of ways. So the economic model of crime, you might argue, is probably more applicable to property crimes, where economic incentives are going to matter more than to violent crime, for example. There's some interesting research on the white-collar crime by Stephen Levitt, the free economics economist from Chicago. And so whilst for most sorts of crimes it seems that education reduces crime, he has information on maths and reading test scores of people who in their childhood years. And then he looks at the relationship between those and white-collar crime. And so you find that people who have higher maths test scores are more likely to engage in white-collar crime. So that's an example actually of the way in which the normal, if you like, negative effect of education on crime applies. But in that case, in the data that he's looked at, actually people who've got better maths test scores are more likely to engage in white-collar crime.
Francis, we've had a bit of a cosy consensus about how good economics is at explaining crime. Maybe, Francis, you want to give us a slightly different perspective?
I've been feeling increasingly uncomfortable because the whole conversation has been predicated on the idea that crime is committed by individuals. And I don't think it is. I mean, let me say to you, what is crime? Crime is harming the social fabric or harming individuals. And actually, if you look at the harm that is done by different kinds of crime, or even some things that maybe we don't think of as crimes, but should be, there is actually much more harm created by those people. LIBOR, pension scams, PPI, tax non-payment, in your supply chain, employing slaves. I mean, this is actually, to me, much greater social harm and individual harm. People have died as a result on a big scale, whereas the conversation seems to be, economists seem to be looking at crime only as if it's one person burgling your house or keying your car. And actually, if you think about the economics of crime, the damage it is done to our society, to our economy, to individuals, it's much greater harm. I would argue the PPI scam or pension scams, that sort of crime is much greater, much more harmful than the person who burgled my house, who made me very angry and upset me a lot, but actually, probably, the people who are doing more harm to me as an individual, as a citizen, and to my family, and to the people in this room, and to everybody else, are the people who are doing this kind of scams that I talked about. Also, the economics of crime is, I think, you're right, you are basing it on the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is there to police poverty. That's what it's about. The criminal justice system does not police the kind of criminality that I've been talking about, nor indeed is it recognised as criminality in a lot of cases. So I'm very worried by if economists are only looking at supporting a system which is, I think, deeply flawed, deeply unfair, and not dealing with the real issues.
I think that's very unfair.
But it makes a lively conversation, doesn't it?
In the sense, there's a lot of work out there that emphasises networks by economists, and that's networks of individuals who may operate just as individuals on their own or operate as a network. There's lots of work on the economics of organised crime. There's lots of work emphasising gangs and where people interact with one another in terms of engaging in crime. Now, there may still be, may well be economic incentives that are affecting those kinds of decisions. There's lots of work on networks engaging in criminal activities who may or may not get caught. And so your LIBOR example may be an example of somebody who doesn't get caught necessarily, or well, it looks like some people will be prosecuted properly for that as well. But the economic incentives can matter here, but you don't necessarily have to get caught for the crime. There's a probability you get caught. And so there's lots of unrecorded crimes that would fit in with the economic model here. But the idea that the economic incentives are going to matter for an individual, was what I emphasised in my talk, but there's a lot of work out there on networks of individuals in lots of different domains, be it the mafia, be it several of the examples that you've given. And of course, it's more difficult because you've only got to think about how the individuals are interacting with one another in the organisation and so on. But there's plenty of work that's actually pushing. This is one of the frontier areas actually where it's pushing forwards actually. So. Yeah.
As an economist, two incidents really clarified my mind how you can look at crime, apart from the standard ways of what you're suggesting, that criminal behavior is rational, and you do cost-benefit analysis, and you weigh up the probability of getting caught, blah, 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 blah. Two cases, one is Vicky Pryce's case, where I have full sympathy for you, and I think you got it wrong, and unfortunately, I start from a premise that we are all criminals. If you ask within yourself, we all commit crimes, big, small, somewhere we have all committed crimes. Okay? If you start off with that premise, it's better perhaps to look at the risk and reward of catching and prosecuting criminals, rather than the risk and reward of committing crimes. It's risk and reward of catching criminals. I'll give you a second case where I was driving last year on holiday in the US. I was driving through a small town, 3 in the morning, I hit a red light, and I wait at the red light. It's a crossroads. I can see around the crossroads there's a police waiting for me. And the red light would not turn green. So I was just sitting in the car, waiting for it to turn green. And the police car is just waiting around the corner. Now, I couldn't get out of the car and ask him anything because that'd be a criminal offense. It's abandoning your car, middle of the traffic. So I had to wait for 15 minutes. Wait and wait until the policeman got out and waved me on. Right? Now you can call that entrapment,
yes,
if you wish, but I think perhaps you're better off looking at, really, we're all criminals, and let's look at the risk and reward of catching criminals. Maybe they're big corporations, maybe they're individuals, but at least we are better off aiming our limited resources in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone in the panel have evidence of economics actually looking at it from the other side, from the sort of the policing side, Brian, about how they go about prioritising what sort of crime they address?
Perhaps it's this is in some sense the other side of the coin from what Steve described, that he was talking about why you would commit crime in terms of the benefits you get from it and the relative benefit of being legal or illegal. But there's clearly a cost that he referred to, and you can probably think of that cost simply in two ways: the probability that you're caught, and then what happens if you're caught. So if we focus on the first one, the probability of being caught, that's fundamentally about the police, what they're doing. And so the obvious question that you want to ask is two things, really. I suppose one is, does having more police officers help? And does it matter what they do? So in one sense, my answer is going to be, of course, having more police must be a good thing. So that's good, since as you said, I help set the pay of police officers. I think having more police is good. But perhaps you can think it a different way. What would be at some point that must be true. And so the example that I've got of why that must be true is from 1944, when the Nazis invaded Denmark. And when the Nazis invaded Denmark in 1944, the first thing they did was they arrested the entire Danish police force. It turns out that street crime went up. Robbery went up enormously in Denmark immediately after that. So that's not surprising. If you have no police, then crime's going to rise. Another example is from Oregon, where because of budget crises a few years ago, they pretty much laid off all of the state troopers who drive around stopping people behaving illegally on the roads. The number of fatalities on the roads rose significantly. So you can see that police numbers must matter at some level. But probably the more important question, and when you think of the austerity drive that's currently going on in the UK, is what happens when you move police a little bit, when you reduce the numbers by 5%, by 10%, what happens? And here the evidence is much harder. And the evidence, I think, is much harder because it's hard to see the cause and the effect. So why do police numbers go up? Well, often they go up because crime's going up, and governments want to respond to that. And so often you'll see the two moving in the same direction, which suggests that if anything, police are doing the wrong thing. But that's unfair because the police are responding, the numbers are responding to the crime. So what you want is examples where police went up for reasons that were nothing to do with crime. And economists, I think, have been quite successful at thinking of clever tricks in some sense to identify that effect. And I'll just give you 2 examples. One that Steve is actually responsible for, which was to look at what happened after the London bombings in 2005. If you're willing to believe that the terrorist attacks in London were unrelated to the general crime trends in London, which seems a reasonable assumption, then something dramatic happened after the London bombings, which was the centre of London was flooded by police. So police were moved from the suburbs of London into the very centre because of the bombings, after the bombings, essentially. Street crime plunged in the central area of London because essentially there was just more police on the street, and so they were deterring people from committing crime. Okay? What's interesting is that there wasn't a reduction in crime in the suburbs. So actually that movement of police really helped in this circumstance. Okay? And so you might wonder, well, why didn't it rise in the suburbs? These people should have responded by increasing their criminal activity. I think there's lots of evidence that what you might call hotspot policing really works. I don't think the numbers matter too much in terms of total number of policing. I think what really matters is what the police are doing. So in most cities, and this is true of certainly in the US, it's pretty much true in the UK as well, most crime occurs in really small areas. So you can probably think of the cities you live in. You can probably name the streets where most crime you think probably gets committed. There are whole swathes of cities where nothing happens. So what about if the police target those areas? Okay, and that's what you think of as hotspot policing. Turns out that works really effectively. And economists, again, have been very successful in thinking about how you can test that strongly. So an example is you can do a randomized experiment where you say to a police force, okay, here are 10 areas what you think are high-density crime. Send more police to 5 of them and don't send any more police to the other 5 and see what the difference is in terms of crime. And when people have done that, again, what they find is that actually focusing police in particular areas where there's a hotspot of crime is really effective. So I think overall, my message in terms of policing and thinking about catching criminals is that police numbers probably matter. They probably are less than actually we think. What really matters is police being effective and productive. And just to finish, one reason I think crime has gone down a lot in the UK and in many other countries is because police have just got better at their job. They're much more efficient at using technology to know where crime is, to know the areas where they should be most of the time. There's no point in policing little villages in England aggressively because there's no crime there. You might as well spend your resources efficiently, and technology has allowed them to do that. And I think that's one of the big reasons, actually, that crime has fallen.
Thank you. Before we go on to the criminal justice system, are there any other burning questions in the room? There's one right at the back at the table.
Thank you. My name's Tony Dyer. I'm a Bristol Green Party. One of the things I wanted to mention was yesterday we had a visit by an organisation to myself and the Green Party councillors from a group that's been working with prostitutes out on the streets and so on. And what they were talking to us about was the fact there's been a massive decrease in the number of prostitutes that are out on the street. But there hasn't been a decrease in the level of prostitution, because what has happened is everybody has now got mobile phones. So instead of being out on the street, they do it behind closed doors. And actually, the level of crime is possibly even worse, because at least when they were on the streets, they often had closed-circuit TV, so people could keep an eye on them and they could feel safer. And what I wanted to point on to that is that maybe disguises some of the decreases in reported crime and so on, is that we haven't actually, it hasn't gone away so much, it's been displaced to other places. And relating also back to Francis' question about different types of crime, I understand that one of the increases in GDP recently was because we were now counting black market economy and prostitution as part of the GDP, and that's why we've suddenly found we have a little bit of an extra money to pay to the EU.
Yeah, thank you. It was actually all countries had to put an estimate of prostitution and illegal drug taking into their national accounts. I can tell you with the effect it had. It was tiny. It was. I mean, I work in the media, so even at the FT, we gave that quite a lot of prominence. It got prominence out of all proportion to its importance in GDP.
It was a few £billion, which is more than you can raise on the mansion tax.
It raised the level of our recorded national income in Britain as it did in all other EU countries. It didn't raise the growth rate at all because basically the Office for National Statistics, because they haven't really got a clue, not about that, but because obviously it's very hard to measure, they put it in a way that means that it's not going to affect recorded changes in output, which was a very sensible thing for them to do, as did every other country. And it had absolutely no bearing on the bill for the European Union. The thing that did have a bearing on that bill was charities. It was because we measured charities differently. So it's all these people working in charities we found were a lot bigger than we thought. That was 40 billion, and prostitution and drugs was about 4. But that's by the by. Francis, do you want to come back on the other part of that question about whether there's more crime going on behind closed doors, partly because of technology, so we don't see it in the way?
I'm not going to answer that question, but though I might do later. But
Okay.
I just want to...
Well, we will come back to
You
that.
will come back to it, yes. Do you want me to just say what
Why don't
not
why don't we move on then
Okay.
to the criminal justice system, about how we
Okay.
deal as a nation with criminality and crime?
Okay. The two fundamental questions that all societies have to ask themselves, and that they've been doing this for 10,000 years, is, what is justice, and how do you respond to people that break the laws that you set up? What is the law? And secondly, the question of tax, which relates to prostitution, because those are the two things that are always with us, tax and prostitution. Who do you raise it from? How do you do it, and how do you spend it? So you've got the mix of those two things. Now, apparently we're in a time of austerity, and reading my Financial Times, my FT, it said that we're going to be facing billions more cuts. The next government's going to have to impose billions more cuts, whichever government it is. So what the current government is doing is cutting money from the prisons. And so what they've done, for example, in order to reduce budgets, is to cut the food budget. So a governor in Bristol, for example, will now get a food budget of £1.96 per prisoner per day. Now, you may have seen in some newspapers, although it wasn't widely reported, there were some prisoners who were in court over the last few weeks, 11 prisoners from a London prison, who were facing charges of mutiny, which is the most serious charges as a prisoner you can face. And it was a weeks-long trial. And what they'd done was they barricaded themselves into their cells and asked for food, and asked to get out of their cells because they weren't getting any exercise. And bless them, the jury found them not guilty. And actually, that hasn't been reported much. And this is exactly what the government wants to do. It wants to cut the food budget. It wants to cut exercise. It has done that. A report on Bristol prison that came out recently showed that the prison now is at unsafe levels. There are so few staff. It is unsafe for staff. It is unsafe for prisoners. 2 days ago, the Howard League had a conference where we looked at the prison system. We had the chief inspector, and we had all sorts of people coming to speak. We also had two people, Karen and Kelly Revel, and they talked about Greg. Greg was an 18-year-old boy, who's Karen's son, who had a history of mental health problems and had attempted suicide in the past. He was received into Glenparva prison and was there for 24 hours before he hanged himself. Glenparva prison has hundreds of teenage boys in it and hardly any staff. So at night they will operate with maybe 2 or 3 staff, most of whom do not have keys. So if Greg had called for help, there was no one there to help him. That is the way we are running our prisons at the moment. So my argument is you cannot cut any more. You cannot cut more from the justice system, from prisons in particular. What you have to do is stem the flow. You have to stem the flow of people coming in. Now, there is some good news I'm going to give you, because I do misery on quite a grand scale at the moment. I have to say I have never seen a public service deteriorate so rapidly as has happened in the last two years in prisons. When the coalition government came in 2010, I was really optimistic. We had Ken Clarke, and he was saying there are too many people in prison. He reduced it by 3,000. Let's get people busy and doing stuff all day, which is what everybody should do. In the last 2 years, all that has been undone, and we now have people committing suicide in prisons at the rate of 2 a week. So you have to stem the flow. If we're going to cut, we have to close prisons. That's fine. I have no problem with that. I would recommend that. But you have to get people, the support to people in advance. And actually, it relates to policing. We've been doing a lot of work on child arrests, reducing the number of children who get arrested. And the police have been fantastically successful at reducing child arrests, down 25% in the last year, which is really great. We're working very hard with police across the country to get that down even further. And in Scotland, there's some really interesting work going on with a cohort study. And an academic cohort study over several years, which showed that if you can keep children out of contact with the police and with the criminal justice system, they are less likely to be antisocial and to commit crimes later on. The criminal justice system and contact with the police actually makes things worse, usually. Not always, but usually. Particularly with children, and particularly with the kind of crimes that we've been talking about. And that actually, the reduction in contact with the police is feeding itself through, so that in Scotland now you're much less likely to be a victim of crime. And the crime rate amongst children has now dropped very significantly. This kind of research is being done very carefully in Scotland, so we can follow it there. And the good news is that because of the child arrests in England going down, and because of far fewer children going through the courts who would otherwise have gone through the courts for really trivial offences 10 years ago, there are now a third the number of children in custody as there were 5 years ago, which is fantastic news. So my argument is less is better. The criminal justice system is not the way to deal with mental health problems, like Greg Revell had. It's not the way to deal with social problems, to do with poverty. It's not the way to deal with health problems. And too often, we've kind of created an industry around the criminal justice system and poured money into it at the detriment of children's services or health or mental health or housing or other things, which actually prevent more crime, I think, as you said, Steve, in some ways. So the criminal justice system it fails because the way it is at the moment. It fails the people in prison, it fails the staff who work in it. It's about to implode on probation and community sentences, which is really worrying, and I won't go into now, but it's very worrying indeed. But it also fails individual victims. It fails the victims of domestic violence. It fails the victims of sex crimes, as we've read about, particularly children, as we've read about in Rotherham and Rochdale, Oxford, and of course every other city in the country. It fails the victims of child abuse. It fails the victims of child abuse in custody. More than 1,000 men have come forward now, years later, having been sexually abused, raped and buggered, and physically abused, using extreme violence from a prison that was set up and that was subsequently closed. But what I worry about is how many people are going to come forward in the future. And most importantly, the criminal justice system fails victims because it focuses entirely on the criminals and not on the victims. And if we do talk about victims, it's always about upping the ante. It's about increasing punishment. You know, what is justice? Well, I'll tell you what it's not. It's not a synonym for punishment.
Can I just ask you about young people? Because we know the cohort of teenagers at the moment are, in some ways, the squarest teenagers we've had in about 40 years in Britain. They don't drink, they don't smoke, they don't do drugs, and they certainly don't get pregnant anymore. Is that into the rates they used to?
Yes, yes.
Are we seeing that now? You said there's fewer number of kids in custody. Is that what's really happening? Is it that the education system or society as a whole is bringing up kids better so that they're all these sort of vices that we used to do are happening much less frequently?
Yes, I think it is partly the retraction and the retrenchment of the criminal justice system. So less policing, that's good. More intelligent policing, so that resolving professional discretion, frontline discretion, if there is a problem, the police have professional discretion to resolve it immediately, rather than going through arrests and custody. I think also, and this is a personal view, okay, so not my charity, not the Howard League. I think the increased feminisation is a good thing. I think we are less tolerant of misbehaviour and violence. And as women have come into positions of more authority and prominence and economic power, you get an increased feminisation, which means that, you know, we ain't going to put up with it anymore.
Brian, how do you see the criminal justice system as an economist?
So I think possibly this is the area where economists have failed. And we failed because we've not managed to convince policymakers that the evidence that we present that we believe to be very rigorous, policymakers just ignore it when it comes to the criminal justice system. So there's been it seems to me over the last 20 to 30 years, there's been an increasing emphasis among policymakers on evidence-based policy. And that seems to be almost non-existent in the criminal justice system. And two examples spring to mind of that. One is just that there's lots of evidence that if you actually spend money on trying to stop offenders re-offending, so either in prison itself by spending money on educational services and the like, or by helping them get jobs when they come back out into the world, that more than pays for itself. Okay? But that's almost always the first thing that gets cut by governments because, you know, it's not politically the right thing to do, seemingly. Another example from the United States, but it's the same sort of illogical policy, is a very famous policy that California had, which was this 3 strikes policy. So in California, the mad Republicans came up with this policy that if you had already committed 2 felonies, then the 3rd felony you would be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, regardless of what that offence was. So stealing a car would get you life without parole if you'd previously stolen 2 cars and been convicted for them before. The good news is that it definitely deterred people who had 2 strikes. There's no doubt about it. Compared to people who didn't have 2 strikes, that policy really reduced the offending rate among the 2-strike people. Okay? However, it turns out it wasn't very cost-effective because although it did stop a number of crimes, in the thousands of crimes it stopped, you know, at the margin, of course, it's quite expensive to lock someone up for their entire life. It's, you know, many tens of millions of dollars over the lifetime. And that's the kind of policy that when you think about, you just think, you know, there's no cost-benefit analysis going on here. We've shown that, yes, it deters, but you've got to think about whether it deters enough. And that's an example where it just didn't. And I think that's where actually economists, you know, must hold their hand up and say, somehow we've got to get across to policymakers, not just economists, but criminologists and all that, got to get across to policymakers that if you want to actually reduce crime and, you know, and help victims, then actually you should look at what the evidence is. And the evidence is pretty strong that all the things that you might think are good really are good. And things like just locking people up is pretty daft.
So what is good? What does good look like?
I don't think there's much evidence that locking people up helps. There's very weak evidence that just incapacitating people works. I mean, you know, clearly it works at the margin and for some types of crimes, but in general, that's not a very effective policy. Some sentencing works, so playing around with sentencing at the margin can work, because people do, you know, as Steve said, you know, you are working out the costs and benefits of committing crime. If you make the costs higher, you'll deter some people, but you just don't deter them in the way, in the size that you might affect. And I think the key reason why that is, and it might sound like almost I'm saying, well, the economics of crime is wrong, because it doesn't seem that changing the deterrence matters very much. I think it's actually partly because of the people who mainly commit crime, or the type of crime we're talking about who get sent to prison. They're disproportionately young people. They're disproportionately people who have disadvantaged backgrounds, as Vicky said. And they're people who don't think very far in advance. And all of our models are about rational agents thinking about the costs and benefits of things. It's not that 18-year-olds aren't rational, it's just that they don't think very much about being 19 or 20. So telling them that the sentence is very high may not deter them very much. Telling them they may go to prison doesn't deter them because they just want the immediate thrill of whatever they're stealing or whatever they're doing that's criminal. And it's not obvious that actually changing sentencing around those people is actually going to work much better. As Steve said, much better just make sure they stay in school.
In fact, as a former joint head of the Government Economic Service, I do hang my head in shame because the cost-benefit has been done. There's no doubt about that. Through the years, the economists there, and I made sure when I was in my post that they were senior enough economists to have some influence, but they were preparing on this cost-benefit, but it was generally ignored because politics intervenes in this case.
Is that because politicians are just want to grab headlines? Is it because the media don't care about evidence, or is it
Yeah.
because the public themselves don't buy economics?
Well, it's not done by economics. I mean, the public will realize that if an awful lot of money is being spent on a criminal justice system which isn't delivering, then we wonder why it is that they may have to pay more taxes themselves to pay for it, because it doesn't do it. I mean, it's like sending someone, to have a new operation coming out from this hospital, and a year later they have exactly the same operation. They go back again a year later to do that. You will close the hospital. It's exactly what's happening with our prison system. You send these people in, and they come out. They in fact, if anything, going to prison means that they are more likely to offend and reoffend than would have been the case otherwise if you've thought of different ways of dealing with it. And yet they do indeed get swayed, the politicians, by needing to win elections and thinking that they need to appear to be tough. But the public is not stupid. The public understands, if they're given the facts, that what is going on right now doesn't necessarily work. But they're not being given the facts. And that's the sad truth. And the facts are that A, the system isn't working because people go into jail and come out and reoffend. So we have more victims, going back to Francis's concern. The whole point should be to reduce the number of victims and the cost to society, whether it's white-collar crimes or anything else. And given that it costs £50,000 a year to keep someone in prison, and if it's long-term with mental problems more, and for women in particular, and I mentioned the issue about children going to care, children of women prisoners are very likely to be taken to care. Only 5% of children of a woman who goes to prison stay in their homes. They either get moved to relatives, which is very disruptive, change schools or what have you, or get taken into care. Temporarily, sometimes for the long term. If a man goes to prison, the child doesn't move, which is the most extraordinary thing, because it's always the woman who looks after the children. And the average cost of keeping a child in care is another £50,000 a year. There are cheaper alternatives which have hugely greater impact on reoffending. So it's a win-win. You spend at most £11,000 a year on it could be as little as £2,000 to do community service with all the extra services that you provide to somebody, particularly for trivial things that many women are involved in. And you get a reoffending rate getting reduced hugely. Reoffending costs between 9 and 13 billion pounds a year to the economy. If you reduce that by even 10%, 20%, it makes a huge difference to our finances. So there is an issue of cost benefit which simply is not looked at. And just to go back to one of the earlier questions on targeting and prostitution, I mean, a lot of the reason why some of these people end up in the criminal justice system is because the police have targets to meet. And if the targets, and low-hanging fruit, so they leave quite a lot of the more serious stuff that Francis was talking about unsolved, despite the sort of improvement in technology, perhaps, that allows them to do some of that. And that's basically what happens. That's why the prisons are full of all these people who really should be looked at differently. And talking about what it leaves you, especially at a time when everything is being cut back, you lock somebody up for 23 hours a day, which I have seen in Holloway. You take away their books, which is what's going on right now. You assume that television is a privilege. I can tell you it hardly worked in my room, but I could just about see various things. And you need a television because you need to have someone to talk to, although it is apparently the first sign of madness. And I started talking to my television one night, and I realized things were beginning to get rather worse. But fortunately, I was moved to open prison the following day. But if you do that, you encourage exactly the sort of behavior that Francis was talking about, which is committing more crimes in prison. So when you come out, you commit even more crimes. And food, that was mentioned. Again, there's a lot of evidence. I've used all that in my research, that if you improve the food, then you also improve behavior in prisons, which means that you reduce assaults and criminal actions in prison by 37%, has been one of the studies suggested. And a lot of that, if it's kept when you move on outside, is a fantastic sort of improvement for society as a whole and should reduce victims. And just to final point, I do say in the book, we are all criminals now. And I've paraphrased Clinton's, we're all Berliners now, of course. And I do actually believe in that very, very strongly.
Thank you, Vicky. Now I'm going to ask a sort of unfair question. I haven't told the panel I was going to do this, but we do have, as Francis was saying, we do have, whoever wins the next election, almost certainly quite a lot of cuts to come. And if we protect health and schools and overseas aid, as all the main political parties are saying we want to, then the cuts in other areas are likely to be reasonably large. If you follow the Conservative party policy, which wants to balance the budget by 2018-19, that sort of suggests that other departments need to cut their costs by about a third. So it's not a small cut, this is an enormous cut if you follow that sort of line. What should go?
I'll give you an unfair answer.
You can give any answer you like.
We need to be doing other things to generate productivity growth, so we don't need the cuts.
Yeah.
Okay. That is absolutely true. So if we get productivity growth, we can avoid some of the cuts. We've been expecting productivity growth every year for the last 6 years, and it hasn't materialised.
It's beginning.
Not much. So if we're unlucky, so we do actually have to face these difficult decisions. What do you do? Do you shut prisons? Cut numbers of police? Where does it have the least or the most beneficial impact as a cost-benefit analysis?
I would close prisons. I'm happy to say that. I'm happy to say that.
I was erring in that direction, given what choices you were saying. But
and we've had sentence inflation. We have more life sentence prisoners in England and Wales than every other country in the Council of Europe added together, and that's 46 countries. So we have more life sentence prisoners in this country than Russia, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Holland, added together. We have massive sentence inflation. We have a huge prison population. And they are expensive, but you cannot cut the money from them. You have to close them. And if you close them, you can. What I would do, then I would invest money in education and industry and things. And we've actually been having this debate at the Howard League because the government is planning to build a Titan prison in Wrexham in North Wales. And they're going to it's going to cost millions and millions of pounds to build this new prison, which is going to have double cells, so people will be locked up, contrary to international rules, to a cell the size of a toilet. And they will hardly ever get out. And why anybody thinks this is a good idea is beyond me. But it was given planning permission by the local authority. And we said to the local authority in Wrexham, well, if the government's got all this money, got this cash, if they've got this multi-million-pound budget, why don't they invest it instead in local industries, in anything, like in local education? Wrexham could really do something fantastically exciting with 500 or 600 million pounds, couldn't it? What a difference that would make to Wrexham. That would save. That would probably mean you wouldn't need perhaps a prison because people would have jobs and healthcare and drug addiction services, and we could sort out the domestic violence, and you could do a lot of stuff with it. But the government's going ahead with it anyway. We lost that argument, but I keep trying.
So, in terms of where you might save money in the criminal area, I agree by and large with what's just been said. But one area that I would say you could actually save quite a bit of money is in combining police forces together. It's utterly insane in a country of our size to have 43 police forces in England and Wales. They're tiny, some of these police forces, and actually a lot of money could be saved just by doing that. And then outside, I'm not necessarily going to make myself very popular here, outside of policing, I think the area that the government should look at, well, two things. First of all, that you shouldn't actually ring-fence anything, it doesn't seem to me, if you're going to make cuts. Because what you're saying to the things that have been ring-fenced is you don't need to think about being efficient and making savings. It's all going to fall on the police or the criminal justice system. Education can make savings. And the final thing I would say, and this is going to make me very unpopular, I suspect, is that there's no reason to protect the over-65s in the way that the current government does. In fact, not only overprotects them, but actually pays them real wage increases most years. We all are supposedly in this together. There are lots of rich, retired people who could contribute. I'm not saying it, there are clearly poor retired people as well who need protection in the same way as everyone else. But, my mum goes on 4 or 5 holidays a year. She probably doesn't need the extra winter fuel allowance.
What we've been discussing is that the cost-benefit analysis tells you that we get very poor outcomes out of a criminal justice system, and that there are far too many people in prison costing too much, and they come out and reoffend rather than being in some way turned around. The education system has failed, so obviously more needs to go into that, because it gets them into a position where almost there is no choice, although I don't want to necessarily justify criminality at all. So the answer is you reduce it back to where we were 20 years ago. It's not as if suddenly we've been doing an awful lot more crime, quite the opposite. And you use whatever extra money that might be available to seriously rehabilitate people. And alternatives are much cheaper. Sending them to prison is not a deterrent, first of all, and second, it actually increases rather than reduces crime. So on those facts alone, you would certainly cut back on the number of prisons. And, Holloway can be turned into a fantastic, very luxurious apartment block overlooking the Emirates for those who've you who are interested in the arsenal. And that's what needs to happen. And I've itemized how much savings there could be, and you can easily cut it back, by half, by which I mean the whole budget, if not more.
Thank you very much. Now, we've got 15 minutes left, and we can have questions on anything. So from the first session, the second session, or any other questions you might have burning. We've got quite a few hands up. I'll take them in turn. And if you want to address them to one member of the panel, just please do so. There's a woman in the second row just here first.
I'm quite surprised that there's been absolutely no mention of the whole privatisation agenda and the financial drivers that gives you to put people into prison when you've got a contract to run a prison with X places, regardless of whether it's full or empty. And plus the whole now ongoing privatisation of the whole hierarchy, if you like, magistrates, courts, probation service, back office police functions, the whole thing, which seems to be increasingly run by G4S.
So for us, how much are we actually contracted into to putting people into prison because we've got 30-year contracts to put people into prison?
It's getting more and more serious, and because, as I said, the probation service now is being privatised as well. So you'll get companies that will be running community sentences and prisons, but they make more money from the prisons. So their incentive will be to breach the people, to fail in the community sentence to get them into the prison. And we did actually find there was only one child prison run by a private company. And if prisoners misbehave, you can go to an external adjudicator who is either a retired judge or a district judge. And they come in, and they're the only people that can give extra days as a punishment. You don't go to CPS, you don't go to the police, you avoid all that, you go to an independent adjudicator, an IA. And this private company was going to this, every time a kid misbehaved, they went straight to the IA, he gave them extra days. Well, that's quite a nice little earner, isn't it? You keep your prison nice and full with children who've been teenagers misbehaving, which is what teenage boys do, after all. And we discovered, when we added it all up, within a year's time, he'd awarded 5 years extra imprisonment. Now, I have to say we made quite a fuss. We took judicial reviews. We got a lot of the time that it overturned, and the government did actually take the contract away from that. It's now a prison for sex offenders because there are an awful lot of them. So, you can challenge it, but my worry is the new contracts that are being awarded for community sentences are being given to the private companies for years and years and years, and you will not be able to cancel them. So if a new government, say Labour has promised they will cancel them, they will have to pay as compensation the profits to that private company for the whole term of the contract that has just been cancelled. It'll make it impossible to get out of. So these companies have built in things that charities who provide these sort of services never get, that kind of thing. The Sodexo, G4S, Serco, Capita, they have gold-plated contracts for all sorts of criminal justice services, which we will never be able to get out of, and will cause huge problems for the future. And it will mean that we have very little flexibility for government to change policy. You can vote for who you like, it'll make no difference, because it'll still be run by Sodexo.
Does anyone know what roughly how much flex there is in the prison system, where we as a society can actually shift numbers down as much as up?
Well, I mean, you can vote a minister in who perhaps is going to be positive about reducing the numbers. But of course, the more they keep people in prison, the costlier it is. And the real worry about the privatization of prisons in particular is that they are offering or getting contracts to build prisons or run prisons on the basis that the cost per prisoner will be reduced. But of course it is reduced because A, the facilities could be a lot worse, and second, including education and so on, and second, they have very inexperienced people who can't deal with any disruptions, and then they lock people up. So the flexibility is to really vote that people are under pressure, but the money perhaps at the end of the day is going to be the greatest pressure that's going to come on the government to change. And in reality, those contracts, there's a basic profit that they make, just to bear that in mind so we don't get too frightened. A lot of it is supposed to be payment by results, so at least if you cancel them, you just have the sort of margin which at least covers the cost plus a little bit more, rather than necessarily the overall amount.
Hello, my name's Nick Hooper. You've talked quite a lot about the economics of prevention, the economics of resettlement, the economics of alternative sanctions. I'm interested in whether there's been any work done on the economics of completely different approaches, like restorative approaches to resolving conflict, particularly in the criminal system.
Brian,
there isn't just restorative, but it's also looking at other issues such as sort of mental health and dealing with that differently and what have you. But restorative justice has proved to be actually a very positive contributor to reducing reoffending, and also in some ways, preventing people from, diverting them from court. I mean, there's an awful lot of that going on, which if it's done properly, so you have them meeting the victim and so on, has a very substantial influence. So the pilots have been very, very positive on this. So the more of that, the better.
Vicky mentioned that huge proportions of men and women in prison services have either been in care previously or were in abusive relationships before. And on the subject of kind of vulnerable people, in the case of people committing crime who are addicted to drugs, do you think it would be a better approach to try and treat the addiction rather than try to treat the crime, and also how drug-based crimes factor into the first talk about economic incentives? Can someone who's addicted to mind-altering drugs really be a rational agent in your model? Yeah.
Do you want to do the first part of that?
The vulnerability is such an issue. I was in a prison last week which holds 15, 16 and 17-year-old boys, about 150 of them. And that's good because they're far fewer than that there used to be. And I went into the SEG, the solitary confinement cells, and there were two boys there. One boy who was serving a longer sentence and who got into a fight because he'd been in this prison for 1.5 years, and he said, I'm going stir crazy, I need to get out of here, I need a change. Because, he was a teenage boy, 16 years old, he just needed a change. So he just exploded. And the other boy was lying in a fetal position on a stone cell, on a stone plinth, with no mattress, and he had cuts all up his arms where he'd harmed himself. He didn't have a mattress because he'd been in hospital 5 times in the last 2 weeks for swallowing it, for eating it. He was so distressed, his level of vulnerability and his mental health. And I started talking to him, and he sat up and he said, Miss, I've got mental health problems. And the magistrate, he kept going out, and I didn't ask what he'd done, I never asked what people had done. But he kept going out into the community. He was being abandoned by the local authority in care, his parents weren't around, and then the magistrates kept sending him back to prison. I mean, it's a completely crazy system. This poor boy, 17 years old, if we gave him a wraparound and a lot of support and help now, he was a bright lad, he could have gone on, but as it is, he's clearly going to spend the rest of his life going in and out of mental health institutions and prisons. There is a very high level of vulnerability in the prisons, people in extreme distress, and we're asking our prison staff, who I have to say are paid less than somebody who works in Lidl, to deal with the incredibly complicated and demanding people. It's not right. If you're going to take freedom away from somebody who is so distressed, you need to make sure that they are treated properly and a real investment, because otherwise they will be the most expensive people for a very long time.
Can I just add that, there are these women's centres, for example, which now deal with this very effectively. So they were started after Baroness Corson did her review in 2007, and there's been lots of money being put into it. The trouble is they're now moving into the they have moved into the probation service, which is having cuts itself. So we don't know if that's going to happen. It's going to continue as is. But they deal with specific problems, drugs, alcohol, parenting skills, which people have lots of difficulties with, and they deal with them instead of this women actually going through the court system. I think that's really important. But we already know that 15% of certainly of women who go to prison are already addicted to drugs, and or they're in there, some 40% I think overall, drug-related crimes, because they've been passing stolen goods for the pimp or whoever it is that they were with. And that is really quite important, because you go into Holloway, where I was, and there are lots of people wandering around on methadone, of course, which is the ersatz drug that they give you. And they queue to get their drugs every morning. And that is all you get. You get a substitute. You don't actually get proper psychological help. It could have been done a lot better elsewhere. And so Holloway is a madhouse as a result. So I would walk, and you keep those people quiet because of that. And I queued behind one queue one day, And by the time I go to the front and ask for my aspirins, the nurse laughed. And I said, aspirins? That's very nice. Here you are, have them. And I was allowed to take them to myself, the sort of thing which isn't normally allowed. But it is incredibly serious, and the staff, just as we heard, you know, it was, strangely enough, built for a mental hospital, to be a mental hospital originally, and then turned into a prison. But it's very interesting that it is a mental hospital, except with no doctors.
Now, Steve, there's often just generally a worry about economics saying people are rational when actually we know a lot of our behaviour is based on instinct or impulse. But that must be especially the case for someone who's addicted. What's your view of how useful economics is in these circumstances?
Yeah, I think it's a very good illustration of the kind of caricature, I think, of economists only taking the rational approach. I mean, the idea about doing some kind of crime, probably a property crime, to feed a drug habit is actually quite interesting. So you don't require rationality at all, really. Economic incentives are going to matter, and actually I think economic incentives really matter in this case, because actually your time horizon to get the money to feed the habit is extremely short. There are various developments within economics. Gary Becker himself actually has various pieces of work on rational addiction and the reasons why people would be shaped by economic incentives to go and do those kinds of crimes. There's also developments in behavioral economics where people talk about discount rates that people have. And so, of course, you can think about the discount rate being, you discount the present very, very, very highly if you're a drug addict trying to feed your habit. And economic incentives will matter very strongly for that, as compared to somebody else who may well be looking at the future and balancing that up in terms of their decision-making process. So at the point in time when you're going to do the crime, and if you've got a very high discount rate, then of course economics can very much explain why you would go and do that in a, if you may want to call it pseudo-rational way, but I think I would still go as far as say in a rational way to obtain the funds to feed your habit.
What cost-benefit analysis impact do you think there would be if we decriminalised drugs almost altogether?
I mean, I always hate saying anything about this because one does get quoted, but I think it would be very helpful.
I'm writing it down.
I was just thinking if so much percentage of the prisoners are from care, should we not be trying to improve care rather than increasing the number of prisons?
Francis, I think that's it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes to all.
Yes.
I think everybody would
One
say
word
yes
up
to that.
Chair, you've made a very good case in the panel for a root and branch review of the criminal justice system. I think that in Bristol here, we've tried really hard to look at solving the problems of young people reoffending. I was involved with a charity which was set up called Making the Change, where we looked to give a safe home for young people who'd offended, that is repeat offenders, one who'd done 17 times back into prison, and we came up with a really good solution, absolutely rejected in the longer term by the Justice Secretary. And I have to say that business understands that the economics of using our people properly is absolutely vital. Therefore, this is a festival economics, and it's about business helping to deliver. And I would suggest to the panel, perhaps, maybe we should be pushing for a root and branch review of the justice system, taken away from the politics of it all. Young people offend because of lack of education. There's greed. There's the issue of trying to influence others to do things. And that's where all the crime starts. You've got to start with the young people and get at it at the start.
Thanks. Francis, do you want to very quickly?
I don't agree with taking crime issues away from politicians, because who would run it if you did? Sodexo, G4S, or administrators? The crime is the most political issue, and I don't like what's happening at the moment, and I never like what justice secretaries do. I mean, I think that's my job, to criticise them. But I don't think you can take it away. I think from politics, awkward though it may be, you touched on an issue there, and one thing we haven't talked about actually is masculinity, because you're talking about young boys. You know, what is it to be a young boy? And crime can be, taking cars and dealing drugs is very exciting, and it is actually quite lucrative as long as you don't get caught. I mean, you probably won't get caught, actually. You know, doing a cost-benefit analysis, you probably won't unless you're really bad at it, because the prisons are only full of people that are really bad at being criminals. And I think we do need to think about, you know, what it is to be a young man. How do we give young men that excitement, that thrill, the future vision of what it is to be a man? And we need to do that better, and particularly with young men who, you know, are not academic or who have maybe who don't have a history of economic of employment in their families. We do need to invest in them, and a lot of those, of course, come from care.
As the last questioner just said, you've made the case for a review of the system. So is there anywhere in the world where it works, where you think, yes, this is what we ought to be doing, what we ought to be adopting?
Good question. One that everyone in the panel can use their experience to give us their answer. Where is the panacea? We'll go. Steve has the least time to think about this.
There's certain places where if you focus on the imprisonment question, there's certain places where many more people are locked away. America and Russia are the two places with the extremely high prison population. I think we can look at the US as a case of where it really is a bad idea to lock so many people away. And so I think we can draw on that, and indeed the Russian situation is also where conditions are extremely bad in certain places as well. And so I think we can draw on that on the other side of things about where we don't want to go, down those kinds of routes. There are successful policies going on in lots of places that could potentially be used. I'm moving away now from the reform of the system to actually the kind of idea about bringing crime back down again. You know, predictive policing is going on in many places as a kind of thing, largely related to the hotspot stuff that Brian was talking about in terms of getting crime down. And it's been pretty successful. The adoption of new technologies to combat crime is absolutely vital, and that sort of transcends international borders in the sense of anywhere where you can do it, but I think that's true of everywhere in the world. Getting to grips with the new technologies, and indeed the way that criminals are using the new technologies is absolutely vital for that kind of thing. Well, who's the most technologically advanced in terms of doing that? Probably the US, ironically, in terms of
best and the
policies. On adopting new technologies, they're pretty good about it, and certainly in policing strategies.
Well, this may come as a surprise, but I'm going to use an American example as well. There was a man called Jerry Miller who was appointed the head of the juvenile prisons in Massachusetts about 30 years ago, and he went round and looked at these places and he found they were horrific, and he closed them all down, all of them. It took him a little while to redeploy the staff, but what he said was, instead of spending whatever it was, $20,000, $30,000 a year looking after this child and locking them in this awful place, each child will have their own budget. It's like a personalised budget system. And instead of putting them on programmes in the community, which is what we do here, we've got programs, so we'll put you on it, whether it's relevant or not. It was individually tailored support for that particular young person. And it was actually locking someone up quite expensive, so they had quite a lot of money. And that money went with their child, and crime amongst young people plummeted because they got exactly what they needed to support them through that transition period called adolescence. So we can learn from that. We can be radical. It was a radical option, and it worked, and it's still working. So that's Massachusetts. The other option thing I'd say, again with young people, if you get it right with the young, you know, they don't grow up to be more difficult criminals. The age of criminal responsibility across most of Europe is at least 14 to 16. In Luxembourg, it's 18. In Italy, they have hardly any young people, children, in prison at all. Their age of criminal responsibility is 14. And interestingly, there's much more emphasis on the family and support for the family. So rather than taking child out of the family, actually what you do is you work with the family, and you have a psychological, sociological and support system for the child and that family, because you usually find that is not just the problem, but it's the solution too.
Brian.
So no country has it right. There isn't a magic bullet. In some sense, I think all you've heard from us all is that there are lots of components that make up both the criminal justice system itself, but also the type of people who commit crime, why they're committing crime, etc. So in an ideal world, if you could create a country where everyone has a job and they're all highly educated and none of them went into care, then that would be the ideal country. It doesn't exist. Well, it almost does in Scandinavia, I suppose, is where we're heading towards. So I think there's no easy answer, and I think Steve's right, that actually what you want to do is look at the policies that work and have been shown to work, and then slowly but surely implement them one by one, and that's the only way to do it. So I don't think any country has it right, and because of politics, that's not surprising.
Okay.
Vicky?
Well, you touched on the Scandinavian countries, and I think they've got it pretty right. They have considerably reduced the number of people in jail because they have many more community services. There is, of course, an example in Italy where women don't go to jail but stay at home near the families, which is really important. But the interesting thing about the Scandinavian, Holland has done incredibly well in this respect. But from what I understand, the Danes have been so successful in reducing the number of people in jail that they now have empty jails. So they're exporting their jails in the sense that they're now getting Belgian prisoners into their jails to fill them up. And that's, it would be great if we can become that type of country.
Well, thank you very much. If I had to sum up very quickly, I'd say I think we've learned about the importance of economics in analysing various parts of both crime and the criminal justice system. And if there's a message from the panel, I think it would be to lock fewer people up and maybe to employ them as economists doing cost-benefit. And I'd like to thank the panel.
Yeah, absolutely.